everyone. Welcome to today's session. My name is Emily Spranger. I'm a graduate learning specialist in the Graduate Studies Support Center. And we are thrilled today to have Dr. Linda Bloomberg come back to us to present Researcher Reflexivity. Couple of very brief housekeeping items. I am absolutely thrilled that we have Annie Belcher here today, who is going to be our American Sign Language representative for the day. And we're excited because it's brand new for us in the Graduate Studies Support Center, and we're thrilled to be able to offer this service. As always, we are recording our sessions. I will send you a copy about 24 hours after this session. We would love for you to have conversation in the chat. If you do have questions that are related to the topic today, don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A of the Zoom. If you have any technical issues with your Zoom, you can find me in the chat. And we do have our closed caption enabled. So you can choose to enable that or disable that based off of your viewing preferences. I think that about does it, Dr. Bloomberg. I'm going to go ahead and pass this right on over to you.
Thank you so much, Emily, as always, to you and the Graduate Studies Support Center for hosting these webinars to support our students and ensure student success and student satisfaction in their studies. Again, I'm so happy to be here to present on topics related to qualitative research, which are near and dear to my heart. And today's particular topic on researcher reflexivity, which really is a key aspect of conducting qualitative research. So I'm going to actually go ahead and switch off my camera so I can focus directly on the PowerPoint, but I am here. And I just wanted to go through the goals and objectives of today's webinar. Firstly, I wanted to cover the idea of the qualitative researcher as instrument and the role of a qualitative researcher with a particular emphasis on researcher power and positionality. Ensure that we all understand the hierarchical structures that are inherent in the research process and that these do not diminish and undermine trustworthiness and ethical standards throughout the research process. And then also really hone in on the criticality of ongoing researcher reflexivity. The word reflexivity is similar to reflectivity, but somewhat different in the context of qualitative research. And we'll talk about that and it'll become clearer to you. So sorry. And then so the webinar outcomes would really be a more greatly developed qualitative mindset and a strengthened awareness of the roles and responsibilities of a qualitative researcher throughout the research process, right from the beginning of conceptualizing the study through collection of data, analysis of data, interpretation of data, and then defining recommendations and conclusions. That said, I just want to stop for a moment and pause here and just point out two important things. The first is that this webinar, as all the webinars I conduct, my hope is that it really is interactive. So I don't want to be the person coming across as a lecturer. I would rather be someone coming across as imparting information, but also welcoming dialogue. So I'm going to stop at various points along the way to for questions, comments, concerns, because I really learn as much as everybody on this webinar in terms of what ideas are out there, what are people thinking, what are people considering, and I want to hear this from you. So your voice really matters a great deal to me in this process. Other thing I want to point out is that research is a complex field. As we know, it includes gathering knowledge, gathering data, analyzing data, and then really disseminating what we have found to a broader population of readers and researchers. So one key aspect of qualitative research is that the researcher is the instrument. The researcher is the instrument of data collection and data analysis, because remember, the researcher is using various methods to collect data and analyze data, but ultimately the researcher is making all the decisions on their own. What data collect, how to collect it, how to analyze data, how to present it, how to represent our study participants, which is extremely important. How do we make sure that we are expressing exactly what they're telling us and not putting our own spin on it, but really allowing them to have a voice in the process and accurately and authentically allowing that to come through in the study's findings. To take a step back, I would like to just, especially for those who may not be as familiar with qualitative research, to go back a step for a moment and talk about the essence of qualitative research. What really defines qualitative research as opposed to, for example, quantitative or even mixed methods research? So first and foremost, qualitative research involves the collection, analysis, and interpretation of narrative and visual data to gain insight into a particular phenomenon of interest, which could be an event, an experience, a process, or even a program. The goal is to describe, understand, interpret, and communicate the essence of the research, what the research actually finds. And as I said a few minutes ago, the researcher themselves are the primary instrument for data collection and data analysis. As such, because of that, the researcher themselves is the strongest influence on the research process, including participant reactivity, as well as all of the study's outcomes. This means that the researcher has the strongest possible impact on the participants and on the research findings. And this has really important implications throughout every stage of the research process, because the subjectivity and positionality of the researcher shape all aspects of the research. Now, when I talk about developing a qualitative mindset, I do so because when we're studying our participants' experiences, when we're doing research on the participants, we are most often studying what we call the other, and they are sharing their experiences with us. They're entrusting us with their experiences, and that's why it becomes so critically important that we actually collect, analyze, and represent the data in an authentic means as possible. As I say, the research participants expect to trust the researcher and the entire research process. And they do so by being ensured that the research is in fact confidential and that anonymity is also ensured. No names of places, no names of the research site will appear anywhere in the final document or the dissertation. But remember, with all this in mind, qualitative research is not about being value-free, and it does not strive to be objective, because the understanding is that the researcher and the research participants are all human beings, and no human being can be totally objective. We all have assumptions and values. We all come with preconceived ideas and notions. That's what makes us human. And so we do not strive to be value-free. Rather, we are upfront and transparent about our values and assumptions. And that's what makes qualitative research strong and viable. And qualitative research has really changed the way that researchers think about and act on issues, including objectivity, interpretation, and representation. And that is why issues of researcher reflexivity and power and positionality become so important in this conversation. I want to read for a moment, and then I'm going to stop for questions or comments, an excerpt from my book, Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, A Roadmap from Beginning to End, which is currently in its 5th edition with Sage Publications. And this is what I want to make sure that everybody is aware of. As emphasized throughout the current qualitative research literature, a researcher can never remain neutral, and nor are they expected to be neutral, since objectivity is not the goal. Rather, transparency is an inherent hallmark of rigorous qualitative inquiry, since objectivity and neutrality are inherently unattainable. I'm going to stop there for a moment. And Emily, if you can let me know if there are any questions in the chat, or if anybody has raised their hands, or even if anybody wants to do so right now. What is anything that I've explained or said so far raised in you in terms of something you'd like to share?
Absolutely, Dr. Bloomberg. I do have a question. And then just so our attendees know, if you would like to ask a question, you're more than welcome to raise your hand and I'll ask you to unmute. But one of the questions we have in our chat is, what do you mean by transparency?
By transparency, I really mean full clarity, full openness about why you're doing a study, what the study's significance will possibly be, what good will be brought about by doing the research, and what you are and who you are as a researcher. Remember, in a dissertation, there is a section to talk about researcher assumptions. And this includes, what do you bring to the research process? Who are you in the research process? Firstly, what are your beliefs and values around the topic that you're studying? And second, who are you in relation to your research participants? Are you their supervisor? Are you their colleague? Are you a friend? Are you someone that brings certain values or ideas to the research process that could in any way be harmful to any of your participants? So all of this is really something that reflexivity covers. In your thinking more deeply about what you bring to the process, your transparency will ensure the trustworthiness and the credibility of the study. I hope that explains. Transparency really is just full clarity, like full disclosure about who you are in terms of this research process.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. Zoanne has a follow-up question. So you have to define yourself? Question.
Yes, you define who you are, both personally and professionally, in terms of the research. You don't have to talk about every single aspect of yourself, but what do you bring to the research process that is important or pertinent to the research? And how and in what ways can your positionality, in other words, your status as a researcher, as a doctor, as a student, as a co-worker, how can your positionality impact the research participants and ultimately the findings? And remember, at the beginning of a study, this is just speculation. You don't know how it's going to impact your study's participants and the entire research process, but you have to be as explicit and transparent as possible regarding how and in what ways you think what you are may have an effect on participants and the research itself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. Can we ask one more question?
This is the interpreter. Really quickly, we're going to be switching to another interpreter.
Absolutely. Thank you, Annie.
You're welcome.
All right, Dr. Bloomberg, another question. First of all, to that point, Zoanne mentioned, thank you. She understands thank you for the clarification. The other question that I do have is, how can the researcher remain neutral if he or she is from the same ethnic or cultural background?
I think whether one is from the same ethnic or cultural background as your participants, which is what I'm understanding the question to be, or whether you are from a different cultural or ethnic community, I don't think makes any difference in terms of being neutral. Remember, as I said, qualitative research does not seek neutrality or objectivity. In other words, we know that people are not going to be neutral and not going to be objective. It's your subjectivity that needs to be made transparent. So what do you bring to the research process? We all come with our own ideas and assumptions, and we may want our study to even come up with certain findings. We may have certain preconceived ideas, but we do need to remain open to the study's findings and what that study actually brings about. So let's put aside ideas about ever being neutral or objective and just come to understand that our subjectivity is part of who we are, and it's not a bad thing as long as it's made explicit. So we do all come with assumptions. We cannot be objective. And that is a goal of quantitative research, which really sets qualitative and quantitative research apart, that quantitative research strives for objectivity and neutrality, but qualitative research doesn't. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. And we can pause there. Oh, sorry. Before I say that, one more question in the Q&A. Can we achieve transparency by addressing the core principles of trustworthiness, credibility, transferability, confirmability, and keep a research journal?
Yes, absolutely. All of those, by addressing trustworthiness, especially credibility, which plays into researcher reflexivity and believability of the findings, and keeping a research journal whereby you are continually reflecting and journaling on the research process and what it's doing for you as a researcher and your reflections on the entire experience. All of that is excellent in terms of maintaining openness and transparency.
All right, Dr. Bloomberg, that wraps up our first round of questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Emily. I'm going to go off video again and continue. Thank you, everybody, for those excellent questions, which also got me thinking, and I hope it's got everybody else thinking, because remember, this is a dialogue and a conversation that we could all contribute to. We all bring the richness of our own experience to this process and to this presentation in particular. So here I'm actually going to be repeating a little bit of what the questions asked right now, and that is that neutrality is not considered part of qualitative research. Subjectivity is inherent in everything that we do because the researcher does not strive for objectivity. Qualitative research seek conscious and intentional tracking of their own subjectivities and their own biases, their own assumptions, and make these explicit to the extent possible, because the goal is to make all of these assumptions, biases, stereotypes, prejudices as transparent and open as possible so the research itself can become credible. Let's now turn to the particular concepts of power and positionality, areas that I became very aware of in my own doctoral studies in studying with Ron Severo from the University of Georgia, who came in to teach us in our doctoral program and who's written quite a lot on power and positionality. If anybody wants to read further on it, I suggest looking him up. It's C-E-V-E-R-O, Severo. So power and positionality refer to the researcher's role, their social location, their identity, with regard to the very complex relationships within the context of the research process. Researcher positionality, as I said earlier, can impact all stages of the process, right from data collection, through data analysis, to data reporting. The researcher, if you think about it, is always essentially in a position of power in conducting the research. You have the power to set up the study, to choose who you want to participate in the study, and even to choose how to collect and analyze data. And so this really refers to what we call the ivory tower. The researcher is sitting in the ivory tower and making all of these very important decisions. And that is why the critical examination of a researcher's identity, assumptions, biases, power and positionality is so very important. And remember, addressing power and positionality is really critical to establishing the credibility of the study. And that is why we really strive to be transparent about this from the very beginning. Remember also, positionality is not just one level, it's multidimensional, and it includes culture, class, gender, age, political or social identity, even our values. All of these aspects that make up a human being. And so the researcher really needs to pay very close attention to all the complex relational aspects that make them up and that are part of the research process itself. This includes how interpersonal dynamics will play out, how issues like power, privilege, and identity can all impact aspects of the research process. And as I said, this includes all aspects of the research process, including developing your research problem, your research purpose, your research questions, selecting and recruiting research participants. How will you select them? Who will you select? Because remember, as a researcher, you have the power and the resources to make all of these decisions and include or exclude whoever you want. It also includes selecting research sites, selecting the data collection methods, and ultimately ways of interpreting the data and providing conclusions and recommendations for the study. So all of this feeds into positionality, and you can see how complex this really is and how much power a researcher really has in setting up and conducting a qualitative study. Remember, power is inherent in all aspects of the research process, and the broader social and cultural context that we find ourselves in daily life becomes duplicated or replicated within the research context. And therefore, playing the role of researcher will reproduce the inherent hierarchical structures that privilege some people, or that silence some people, or that deny the existence of some people even. So everything we think of as a human being out in the world, in our daily lives, we bring to the research process. These are our assumptions, our biases, our prejudices. We cannot deny that we don't have any of these. And so to be attentive to issues of diversity and inclusion and access, it's very important to highlight the ways that the research participants who identify as minorities or underrepresented or marginalized groups feel that they're engaging with you as the researcher. And here again is a really important critical piece of reflexivity, and that is, how do our research participants who may be from minority or underrepresented groups, how are we going to welcome them into the research process and make sure that we are actually including them and allowing them a voice? Again, I'm going to stop here for a moment before we start examining some more some other important concepts. Emily, have any questions popped up or any ideas?
Yes, just a moment. Another expert for power and privileges, but I didn't quite catch the name. Dr. Bloomberg mentioned another expert for power and privileges, but I didn't quite catch the name. Are you able to repeat
Oh, yes.
that?
I was referring to Ron Severo, who has written on power and positionality. Cervero, Severo. He works at the University of Georgia, and he's written a number of books and articles on power and positionality in qualitative research.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. I hope that helps, Jessica. And at this time, I don't see any hands raised, and I don't see other questions at this time.
Okay, great. We'll continue, and I will be stopping again, no doubt. Okay, so as we can see already, the research process is fairly extensive and complex. There's a lot to take in, there's a lot to consider, and there's a lot to be very, very cognizant and sensitive to. And let's take a deeper dive now into this whole idea of researcher reflexivity. As I said, and I know I'm repeating myself, the researcher does not strive to be objective because they cannot. They acknowledge their inherent subjectivity, which are their biases, assumptions, preconceived ideas, preconceived notions, bias, prejudices even. And a central aspect of qualitative research and the quality of qualitative research is the researcher's ability to be reflexive. And being reflexive means that you disclose yourself in the research process so that everybody understands what you're trying to bring to the process and what you do bring to the process, rather than trying to eliminate your effect on the process. And reflexivity requires a really deep dive into your own views and philosophies about life and how these may influence the study, right from the design and execution through the findings and interpretations. Remember, it's all about, reflexivity is not a once-off. It continues throughout the entire research process. Now, to ensure credibility, critical reflexivity is important at the stages of data collection, data analysis, interpretation, and representation. And by representation, we're going to go into each of these a little bit more deeply, but representation is how you actually represent what you have found in your participants' own words and how you convey their voice and don't change it to mean something else. Let's start with the first stage, which is data collection. The qualitative data is collected by ways of various methods that you as the researcher determine. And these methods can include individual interviews, focus groups, which is essentially a group interview, observation, document review, imagery review, even open-ended surveys. The qualitative researcher also decides what type of data collect, whether it's demographic, that is information about the research participants, their age, their stage of life, their occupation, etc. Perceptual information, which is what the participants think and feel, and also the experiential information, what is going on in their experiences that you are looking to convey and to report on. The second aspect after data collection that we really need to take very good care of in terms of reflexivity and transparency is data analysis. And qualitative data analysis is the process that seeks to make sense and deeper meaning of the data. In other words, what does the data tell us? What is really going on here? As the researcher, you have the power to make that determination. You are the person that is going to interpret what you think the data is saying. And that's hugely powerful and very, very different to quantitative research that uses statistical measures, which are cut and dried. It's black and white. It's yes or no. This is what the statistics tell us. There's no interpretation required. It's objective, it's clear, and there's no questioning it. Whereas in qualitative research, you as the researcher bring your power and positionality to the research process to make these very important decisions of what the data actually means. As people who are already involved in qualitative research, and for those of you who don't yet know, the way that we analyze the data in qualitative research is generally through coding and developing themes. Again, very, very different to how we analyze data statistically in quantitative research, because again, the codes and the themes are things that the researcher themselves decide upon. Nobody is telling the researcher what codes to apply to their data, and nobody is telling the researcher what themes are emanating from those codes. It's all about the researcher's decision and full transparency. So once we've collected data, collected data, analyzed data, we then have to interpret what the analysis really means. And this includes how the researcher understands the research participants and their experiences and makes decisions about this very much deeper sense of meaning that the analysis has brought about. So we have the codes and themes, we have everything laid out according to research question. Now we have to decide, well, what is really going on? What is this telling me as the researcher? And what am I going to report on? Again, hugely important decisions that the researcher makes on their own. And finally, the representation of the participants' own experiences. The researcher needs to think very, very critically and deeply about the findings and the ways in which the researcher will represent the site or the setting, whether it's a school, an organization, a program, etc., and also represent each and every one of the research participants. The question that a researcher, qualitative researcher, should be asking themselves is, for whom do I speak and with what voice? And to what end am I conducting my research? In other words, why am I doing this research in the first place? What knowledge do I hope to shed light on? Am I really representing my participants authentically? And what voice am I giving them? Am I giving them full transparency to allow their voice to shine through and to be what the findings really are? As a researcher, you need to consider all of these issues, no matter who or what you're doing your research on. It really is an ethical responsibility to examine our roles as researchers and challenge our own explicit and explicit biases and assumptions. Remember, we do sometimes have inherent biases that we don't even really understand yet. And so journaling and being very, very critically reflective about what we're thinking, what we're seeing, what we're experiencing may even bring about some implicit or hidden biases that we didn't even know we were carrying around with us. And that's natural. We're human beings. We are not always aware of why or how we think in certain situations. And so really examining ourselves is a really wonderful way to even shed light outside of the research process on who we are as human beings and what we are carrying around with us and why. It's really important to think about that why. Why do I think this way? Why am I making that assumption? What brings it about? What's causing this? What is the root of this? And then, is there anything I need to do to change this? And if so, why? And all of these questions are really excellently addressed through reflective journaling. Remember, it's all very well to think about all different things and to walk around thinking about these, whether we're at work or at home or laying in the bathtub. But a really good practice for qualitative research is to keep a reflective journal. And this is an ongoing opportunity to develop the research habit of deepening your thinking around critical and key issues inherent in the research process. Keeping a chronology of all your thoughts, questions, assumptions, and ideas. In other words, don't erase anything. Date your journal entries. And you may take a look back 6 months down the line or a year down the line and see what you were thinking 6 months or a year prior. See if your assumptions and questions and thoughts have changed. And if so, try and reflect on why they've changed. What has brought about the change? And if they haven't changed, think about why you're not changing. Is there a need to change? Maybe not. Because reflection and deep reflection really allows you to make those deeper connections between the ideas that you have and shed light on your developing perspectives, viewpoints, and questions. Again, it's not just for the purposes of the research process. This is a great way for you to develop as a human being by questioning who you are and really trying to understand better who you are and what you bring to life. What do you bring not just to the research process, but to your life, to your family's life, to your work situation, to your personal experiences? What are you really bringing and why? It's that why, that deeper why, that is often very uncomfortable to address, but so necessary. Reflection also provides information that you can draw on for your studies, analysis, and interpretation. So when it comes time to write your findings, develop your analysis and interpretation, The reflective journal is a great opportunity to go back to and look at your thought processes over time and really be able to reflect on why, if at all, you're changing in your outlook and what may be contributing to that change. Don't be afraid to ask yourself why and why not at all stages of the research process. I'm going to stop there, Emily, again, because we've covered quite a bit, and I want to hear what people are thinking right now. I really value your thoughts and considerations.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and see if Zoanne is able to unmute.
Thanks, Zoanne.
I think I am. Am I there?
You're great.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Bloomberg.
Hi, Zoanne.
Okay. You knew I would have a question, right?
I'm happy you have a question. I'm great with that. Thank you.
Okay. So you are saying that the reflective part of yourself is how you actually look at the entire process through your own eyes, and you put that into every piece of your process. Am I getting it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. It really is how you think more deeply about what you're bringing to the research process as a human being. This can be personally and professionally. Remember, we cannot separate ourselves as from our personal experiences from our professional experiences. We are the same person, or generally the same person, in our work situation and our personal lives. We are who we are. And we carry around with us certain assumptions, that some of which we develop early in life, some of which we develop later in life, some biases and prejudices that may spring up according to particular circumstances that we encounter, or things that we read, or something that we become aware of, or something that somebody else tells us. And this is what makes us human. We are not robots. We all carry around these very human aspects inside of us. And so making these transparent in terms of how will these thoughts, feelings, assumptions, etc., and perspectives impact this research process. Remember, we don't have to write an entire book on it. And generally, it's just a few paragraphs are required in the dissertation, in the assumption section, and sometimes at the end. I love to ask my students to write what I call a researcher reflection, a final researcher reflection, as the very, very, very final few paragraphs, or even one paragraph of their dissertation, because that gives the researcher a chance to go back to your original assumptions, which you're not going to change. Once you've written them in your chapter 1, those are what they are. And then think about what you wrote back in chapter 1 or section 1, and then think about what you've actually experienced in this research process and what the whole idea of reflexivity has meant to you as a researcher. So again, it's really about thinking more deeply about who you are and what you may bring to the research process in the very beginning stages of your dissertation. And then finally, at the end, reflecting on what you did bring to the research process and how you think you impacted, if at all, any aspect of that process.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Zoanne, for that question.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank you,
it.
Zane.
Thanks.
Another question raised. Jeanette, are you able to unmute?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Jeanette. Hi.
Oh, hello. Okay, I have a question about the reflective journal. I started a journal, but it was more like on like annotations that I had during right now I'm in my section 2 of my dissertation. So would I, for that reflective journal, will I need a different journal that is just about the process? No, I could use the same.
Remember, your journal is something no one's going to read. It's your personal property. And you can have it on a Word document. You can have it in an actual journal, a physical hard copy journal. You can have different journals. You can be writing on a whiteboard. You can be writing on flip charts. You can be writing on index cards. Any way you want. There's no one way of doing a reflective journal, as long as you're writing down and keeping notes of what you're seeing, thinking, believing, and reflecting more deeply on it. So you can keep it in the same journal.
I have a follow-up question. Is this the same thing as an audit trail, or that's something different?
The audit trail is really more about what you're doing at certain stages. So in week 1, I did this. In week 2, I did this. This is how I did it, etc., etc. The audit trail is not so much about reflection, but about actuality. So if somebody wanted to replicate your study, they would know exactly what you did to collect data, how you collected it, how long it took you, what instruments you used, then how you analyze the data. That's all about the audit trail. The audit trail is really about step 1, step 2, step 3, right up until the end. And it's really kind of, I wouldn't use the word objective, but it's clear. It's this is what I did. Whereas the reflection is the deeper thinking and critical thinking about deeper issues.
So that would be, in something, it wouldn't be on the same reflective journal.
It can be. No, you can have your journal divided into 3 parts. One part can be your audit trail, one part can be your reflections, and another part can be your annotations, as you had. Yeah, or you could have 3 separate books or 3 separate Word documents. Doesn't matter. However you do it, there's no right or wrong. All of this is a personal preference of how you want to actually do it. You can include pictures, you can include graphics, you can have charts, anything you want that will be useful to you.
Is that good, Jeanette?
Yes, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Dr. Bloomberg, we have about 20 minutes left. There are 2 more questions in the chat, but I wanted to.
Oh, no, let's do them because
Okay, great.
I'd love to do them now and move on. We'll make good timing. I know we will.
Okay, great. So when we do uncover biases based on our own personal or professional experiences, how can we be sure that the outside world, the world outside of the one we exist as a qualitative researcher, is willing to forgive the power and positionality we possess as a qualitative researcher enough to value our research?
What an amazingly excellent question. And thank you for that. Firstly, we never have to make apologies for who we are. Each of us brings our own experiences, perspectives, and biases. Unless these are in any way offensive to anyone else, they are what make us up. I think that if we are transparent enough to be brave enough to really state what we bring to the research process and who we are in terms of power and positionality, and once we've laid that out, I believe that a reader, we don't want readers to forgive us or cut us any slack. We just want readers to understand who we are. And if what we bring to the research process does impact the research and we are transparent about it, then that's all we can do. We cannot erase who we are. We cannot change our biases unless we work on them and consciously want to think a different way. But remember, it's all just about transparency and openness. And we're not looking to seek forgiveness from anyone or to make amends. We are just seeking to be a real human being that understands who we are because we've really made an effort to delve into and ask ourselves those hard questions about who am I as a human being? Who am I as a researcher? And what am I bringing to this research process that will hopefully benefit the research process and not make it a detrimental experience for anyone involved?
Thank you so much, Dr.
And I just want to say one other thing, that IRB, the Institutional Review Board, takes very, very, very stringent and good care to eliminate any possible harm. So vulnerable populations, being children, prisoners, people who are disabled, we need to really tread very carefully when we are working with vulnerable populations. And usually this takes a lot of time for IRB to approve, if at all. So the IRB is very, very, very careful to uphold all aspects of the Belmont report to ensure that the research participants are never used as pawns in a political process, are never used as people that can be abused in the research process, because in the past there have been incidents over time and in history where human beings have been used in research against their will or have been deceived, or the findings of research have been made public when it was promised that they would not. So we have at NU and at all universities a very, very excellent IRB review process whereby, aside from our assumptions, all aspects of the actual research will be maintained so as not to harm any research participant. So the IRB is doing their bit on that end. And we as researchers do our bit in terms of our power and positionality and minimizing any harm or impact on our research participants or on the research site.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. And there were just some comments in the chat thank you for explaining that. And I do want to add this. This is an add-on from Crystal's original question that brought us to this. She had mentioned that's powerful. Our goal is to not have our readers forgive us, but rather to know us, and perhaps even thereby to know our research. Thank you.
I love that. I love that. If you'll capture that, if you'll capture all the comments,
I will.
Emily, it'll be great, because that is such a valuable comment, and I really appreciate that. And please, no one feel afraid to challenge me on any of these issues. I am trying to be as reflexive as possible myself and be as mindful as possible that everybody has their own view on life and everybody has their own view as a researcher, as a human being. And so I am in no way trying to impose my view on anyone. And please call me out if you think that I say anything that is in any way contrary to what anyone believes. And I'm here to learn as well. So please do so.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. We'll pause there and we can continue.
Perfect. I'll switch off my camera again and we'll continue. So developing critical questions to challenge your own thinking is what it's all about. Credibility is the researcher's ability to take into account all complexities that present themselves in the study and to ensure that the study is indeed truly trustworthy. Reflecting on the study's credibility, there are many questions you can ask yourself in this regard. For example, in what way does my positionality impact aspects of a research design, research site, data collection, and data analysis? Second, is qualitative research, because it uses purposeful sampling, what should I consider when selecting my research site and research sample? Remember, in qualitative research, the sample is not random as it is in quantitative research. So you are making very important decisions about who to include in your research study and who to exclude. In other words, ask yourself, why am I including this person and why am I maybe excluding somebody else, and why? Questions to ask ourselves during data collection are, what data will I collect and why? Who will I collect the data from and why? How will I select my research sample? And what data collection tools am I going to include, and why am I making these choices? When we reflect on data collection, we can ask ourselves some deeper questions about, have I examined the ways in which my biases or assumptions may affect the way I collect data? In my sample selection, am I remaining inclusive? In other words, am I excluding anyone, even inadvertently? In data collection, have I respected my study's participants and attempted to the best of my ability to safeguard their rights? And finally, can any harm befall the research participants or the research site as a result of my data collection process? These are all very important questions that you could actually put down in your journal and ask yourself these questions. Literally ask yourself these questions and write down your own responses. Let's reflect for a moment on analysis and interpretation. As I said, it's an act of power to analyze and interpret someone else's reality and tell their story. And so we have to understand that this is really a complex issue which has to be addressed by transparency and full integrity. Addressing this ethical responsibility of transparency requires that we need to remain reflexive at all parts and stages of the research process, and also remain open to critical feedback and change. So one great way to think more deeply about issues and ideas and our own perspectives and our own worldview is to have discussions and dialogue with people in your life. It could be colleagues, family members, even your dissertation committee, and try and better understand who you are and what you bring to the research process, and really be open to criticism, be open to feedback, because the person that we're dialoguing with may tell us something that we don't really want to hear. It may be hurtful. It may be uncomfortable. But sometimes we learn through discomfort, and we learn through transformation of thinking. And that's what the whole idea of transformative learning is all about, that we learn through a disorienting dilemma. We hear something or read something or become aware of something that does not really fit with what we believed to begin with. And so how do we reflect on analysis and interpretation? We ask ourselves these deep questions like, have I examined the ways in which my biases or assumptions may affect analysis and interpretation? What do the data tell us? And to what extent am I allowing the data to speak for themselves? In other words, how am I shaping and informing the study's findings with my own assumptions and biases in place? What steps am I taking to remain open to new possibilities and alternative explanations? And if I'm not remaining open, why am I not? In my analysis and interpretation, have I fully respected my study's participants and attempted to the best of my ability to do justice to their experiences, no matter what I think or no matter what I imagine to be true? And finally, can any harm befall the site or the research participants as a result of my analysis and interpretation? And this is something to really consider very deeply, because a dissertation or a research report can be read by the general public. And so we do have to be extremely mindful of how we analyze, interpret, and represent our studies participants. And finally, this representation piece. The issue of the other in research has a long history and legacy, because generally we are doing research on the other, someone different to ourselves, someone that we haven't had their same experiences generally. And so questions around voice, language, participant portrayal are sources of ongoing discussion in the world of research. There are many aspects to consider when formally writing up a qualitative research dissertation in order to authentically represent our research participants, their contexts, their lives, their diversity, and all aspects of the experiences they're telling us. Everything they choose to tell us is something we really need to respect and value, because the goal ultimately is to produce an authentic, respectful, and ethical representation of individuals, of groups, and ultimately of communities, because each individual belongs to a community and each individual's experience contributes to their community and is of value and to be highly respected. Sorry. So now I'm going to stop again, because now we've covered these very deep questions that I wanted to lay out there, and that I really think could be part of a great prompt for yourselves to copy and paste these into your research journal once you receive this presentation from Emily later today or tomorrow, and try and answer these questions for yourself. Maybe today, and maybe again in 6 months, and maybe at the end of your research, to see how have you changed. That's a great exercise to do for yourself, because our thinking as human beings does and should change over time. That's how we develop and learn as human beings. That's how we grow as a human being. And so looking back over time at the way you've answered certain questions is very telling and very informative and very illuminating of who you are as a developing human being. So I'm going to open my video up again and look forward to questions and discussion.
Wonderful. Dr. Bloomberg.
And we have about 7 or 8 minutes to do that, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, great. I have a couple of questions in the chat. Feel free to pop questions in the Q&A if you would like. I'll start off in the chat. Dr. Bloomberg, please, is there a difference between reflectivity and reflexivity in research?
Okay, let me be perfectly clear. It really is one and the same thing. Reflexivity is really critical reflectivity. And it's a word that is used in qualitative research. It's become like a terminology, a buzzword, but it really is the same as critical reflection, deep thinking. And really the critical part of it is just not being like shallow about it, but really being critical and criticizing yourself, being critical of yourself. Like, why am I thinking this? What's bringing this about? Do I need to change? And if so, how can I change? So really just one and the same thing. An excellent question. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, the next question I see in our chat is, is it possible as the researcher that you would be harmed yourself in the process? Harm
yourself?
Yes, you would be harmed yourself through this reflective process, through the reflexivity piece.
The only harm that can come is discomfort. And it is uncomfortable to think deeply and sometimes realize or come to be aware that you do have a bias or you do have a prejudice, and that it may not be very pretty, may not be very nice. But as a human being, you've come to believe that because of X, Y, and Z. Experience, or what you read, or what you heard in the media, or what somebody told you, or what you saw on the street corner. So yes, there is discomfort, but remember, nothing happened from comfort zones. No change happens from a comfort zone. And according to transformative learning theory, we change and develop as human beings due to disorienting dilemmas, which are really shifts in our thinking that come about from realization that something is amiss or something is not as we thought it would be. So the only harm is the discomfort. But as I say, nothing good develops from a comfort zone. So the discomfort is the need to change. The discomfort is the need to revise or to refine or to be more aware or more cognizant or more caring or more real or have more integrity. So I wouldn't call it harm, but it's not always comfortable, put it that way.
Thank you for that explanation, Dr. Bloomberg. This is a pretty good question. I know that you have centered this research or reflexivity through the dissertation process, but is reflexivity practiced as in other aspects, like through graduate students, maybe that are doing their masters, or of course.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Reflexivity is for human beings generally. Some people like to go into therapy to help themselves be more aware and cognizant of who they are. Some people like to question themselves. Some people like to have a family member question them or not question them. Sometimes we put up a big wall when someone starts asking us questions that are hitting hard at some soft, sensitive spots within ourselves. But reflexivity is not just for the research process. It's a great, some people journal on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, not for research purposes, but just for human growth purposes. A lot of human development programs have journaling incorporated because journaling is really just a great way to express. Some people use a tape recorder and speak into it every day or every second day or week or month just to like express themselves. So it's really the way that you feel most comfortable expressing yourself, but really challenging yourself, not to remain in a comfort zone, but to grow as a human being and to develop into a more well-rounded, open-minded, open perspective person who's willing to listen to other people and not be fixed in your own rigid, narrow compartment forever.
And I appreciate that because I know that this particular session is about the reflexivity piece as a researcher, which generally implies as a doctoral researcher. But I do think it's applicable to all other aspects of life. And I know that as a mindfulness practice, it's quite common to do some sort of journaling in a reflexive way.
Yeah. And I think you've just, a really important word is mindfulness. That reflexivity really encourages mindfulness, being more aware, being more present, being more cognizant of what's around you and what you bring to the situation. Sometimes we really don't realize what we're bringing, a bad energy or just something that seems rigid or closed-minded. And it's really an amazingly elucidating experience to become aware of something within ourselves that we may not have realized. And so the reflective journaling and the ongoing reflexivity by way of dialogue and talking to people and being open to criticism and feedback just brings us to a higher point in our development.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. Couple more questions. Is this process of personal reflection or reflexivity and transparency applied to the researcher who is following the quantitative approach?
I would say absolutely. Any research process in any human being can only benefit from being more open-minded and more open to new ideas. Even a quantitative researcher, they may be striving for objectivity, which is fine because that's part of the paradigm. And they may be using statistics, there's no question. It's either yes, no, it tells you what it is. But as a researcher, you still not, in my mind, and in the view of qualitative researchers, even a quantitative researcher cannot really be objective because they're still a human being. How can any human being shut off their own personal biases, assumptions, prejudices completely? I don't believe we can. So yes, reflexivity is valuable in any context in life and also outside of the research process.
So this is a interesting idea as well too. Say you're doing your reflexivity as a researcher and you start noting the frequency of something that continues to come up in your research. Does that move your research to quantitative research?
Oh,
This
no,
is- Yeah, I didn't. think so.
no, that would not be necessary. If you've chosen to do qualitative, you would stay with qualitative. You've chosen to do quantitative, you'd stay with that unless there was a reason to change, but reflexivity has nothing to do with it.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah. And depending on where our students are in their journey as a doctoral student, I can see why there's a question for quantitative versus
Right,
qualitative, and then
absolutely.
how that fits
And the
in
way
there.
that you set up a qualitative is very different to the way you set up a quantitative study. And so, you know, the qualitative research doesn't have any hypotheses to begin with. A research problem is very different. The research purpose is very different. Qualitative research is all about deeper understanding and shedding light on an experience, exploring an experience to describe it. Whereas quantitative is really to prove something, true or false, negative or positive, and to look at cause-effect relationships, which is not the case in qualitative research. So if you've started along the path of a particular methodology, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, it's very unlikely that you're going to switch to something else. If you're setting that study up very thoughtfully, because your data collection methods are going to be completely different, you're not going to use interviews and open-ended surveys and observations and focus groups in a quantitative study. So if you've gone down the path of quantitative, you're most likely going to finish a quantitative study, unless you absolutely choose to change, in which case you'd have to go back to the beginning and set the study up completely differently.
Absolutely. And but nonetheless, both quantitative or qualitative researchers could
Absolutely.
engage in
Every human
reflexivity.
being can be reflective. That's my
I-
final word on that. That every human being can benefit from being a more thoughtful, deep thinking person.
And I would have to concur with you on that thought. Anything in closing, Dr. Bloomberg, before I wrap up tonight's session?
Are there any questions from participants? No. Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to say how grateful I am to you, Emily, and again to the Graduate Studies Support Center for facilitating these open discussions where we can all learn with and from each other. And I also want to thank all the many people that have joined here today to spend their hour with us all in learning about this important topic. And I really hope that it's been valuable. And I know that Emily will be sending out a recording of this presentation. I hope that people will also be able to take the questions off the PowerPoint and actually look at them and try and apply them in your own life, in your own journals. When you're ready to do so, there's no rush or urgency to do it, but at the right point. And just once again, thank you so much to everybody. I really appreciate your time and commitment and the wonderful questions, the thoughtful questions, which have also got me thinking and which I really appreciate.
Absolutely. I always learn so much from our sessions. And I do want to make one announcement. Dr. Linda Bloomberg is coming back to present October 10th, mixed methods research. So we've had some questions about that in the past. And then, as always, our Skill Up series is aimed at providing tips, tools, strategies for academic success and to help you along your journey as a student at NU. So if you have anything that you would like to see in the future, please don't hesitate to note that in the survey that you will receive after this session, or you can find me at gssc@nu.edu. Always welcome to send your ideas our way. We are here to support you. So until the next time, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you again.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening.